She was only there to serve drinks, but that night, in a room filled with people who could buy and sell an entire city, she inadvertently uttered a sentence that silenced everyone. A maid, 24 years old, nameless, powerless, unarmed. And in just a few minutes, she became the most dangerous thing in that room. This is the story of Serafina Vale, the woman who walked in that night with a tray in her hand and walked out with something no one could buy. Like, comment the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed, and watch until the end to find out how she gets out. The service elevator smelled like bleach and old cigarette smoke baked into the walls over decades, and Serafina Vale stood inside it with her back pressed against the metal panel, her eyes closed, counting her own heartbeats the way her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old and scared of thunderstorms. She wasn't scared of thunderstorms anymore. She was scared of losing this job. The elevator shuddered upward. 43rd floor, the Black Meridian Hotel. She'd worked here for 14 months, cleaning rooms mostly, sometimes covering the laundry rotation when Carmen called in sick, which was often. Tonight was different. Tonight, Marcus from Banquet Services had shown up drunk. Actually drunk, cologne soaked in whiskey, eyes pointed in two different directions. And the floor manager had grabbed the first warm body in a uniform he could find. That body was Serafina's. Cocktail service, he told her, thrusting a silver tray into her hands. 43rd floor, private event. You stand near the east wall, you keep glasses filled, you do not speak unless spoken to, you do not make eye contact with anyone longer than 2 seconds. He'd paused. Actually, don't make eye contact at all. She'd asked what kind of event. He'd looked at her the way people look at a question they wish hadn't been asked. The kind where you keep your head down and your mouth shut. The elevator opened. The ballroom hit her like a physical force, sound and light, and the particular smell of serious money, which was different from regular money. Regular money smelled like nothing. This smelled like leather and imported flowers and something underneath that she couldn't name, something dense and watchful, like the air before a storm decides what it's going to do. Crystal chandeliers threw light across maybe 60 people arranged in clusters around low tables and a central raised platform. The platform was empty now, a velvet-draped surface under a single overhead spot. The men wore tuxedos. The women, where there were any, wore things that cost more than Serafina made in a year. Everyone held a glass of something. Nobody was looking at her. She moved toward the east wall the way Marcus had told her, keeping her steps small and her shoulders neutral, the way she'd learned to make herself take up less space in a room. It was a skill she'd developed over years, a specific kind of physical grammar that said, I am not here. I am furniture. I am the background of your evening. A white-gloved server near the bar reloaded her tray without being asked. 2 glasses of champagne, one of something amber. She moved through the room. The men around the nearest table were speaking in low voices about something involving numbers, shipping tonnage, she thought. Then something about a route through the southern corridor. Then a name she didn't catch. She wasn't listening. She was watching feet, watching the distance between bodies, watching the geometry of the room the way she always did, reading the space so she didn't bump into anything, didn't spill anything, didn't become a problem. Then a hand shot out and stopped her. Not aggressive, just stopped her. A wrist that looked like it had been carved from something dense. The man attached to it was maybe 55, thick through the chest, with the kind of jaw that had never been soft even when he was young. He had cold gray eyes and a drink in his other hand that he hadn't touched. You. His voice was gravel, soaked in something expensive. Champagne. She set a glass on his table without making eye contact and turned to go. Hold on. She stopped. How long have you worked here? 14 months. She kept her gaze at the middle distance, the way you look at nothing in particular, which is actually harder than it sounds. Tonight is your first night up here. It wasn't a question. She said yes anyway. He studied her for a long moment with the disinterested focus of a man who spent his life cataloging threats. Then he looked away, and she kept moving. She learned later that his name was Elias Crow. She learned it the way you learn things about a person after something has already happened between you, when the knowing comes too late to be useful. The event was an hour in before the argument broke out. She was near the east wall when it started. Not an explosion, but a pressure change, the way a room sounds different when everyone in it suddenly starts listening to the same thing. Two men at the center platform, voices climbing, and the crowd around them drawing back slightly the way water draws back before something large surfaces from beneath. One of the men was younger, maybe 40, with sharp Mediterranean features and a suit that fit so well it looked like it had grown on him. The other was older, heavy, red in the face, with the careful stillness of a man working hard not to say something irreversible. 312 million, the younger one said. The room was quiet enough now that the words carried. Gone. Not lost, not delayed. Gone. Because your people filed the wrong documentation on the Bremerhaven transfer and triggered a customs flag that shut down the entire route. That flag was already in the system before my people touched it. The flag was inactive. Your filing activated it. There's a difference between a landmine and a landmine someone steps on. Serafina kept her eyes forward and her body still. She was good at this. She was excellent at this. Then Elias Crow's voice came from her left. The girl. She didn't move. The girl with the tray. She turned. The room was looking at her. All of it. 60 people in a room that smelled like serious money and something watchful, and every pair of eyes had just swung in her direction. Elias Crow gestured at her with 2 fingers. Come here. She came. He looked at her the way you look at something you're considering using. You've been standing near that wall for an hour. Did you hear what these men were discussing? I wasn't paying attention, sir. That's not what I asked. The younger man with the Mediterranean features, she'd learn his name later too, Dante Farrow, old family, new money, very specific reputation, was looking at her with something that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite contempt, something in the space between. She's a maid, Dante said. She's standing here, Crow said, and I'm tired of listening to the same argument for 40 minutes. He looked at her. The Bremerhaven transfer, the customs flag, you heard it. What do you think? The silence in the room had weight. Serafina could feel it pressing against the back of her neck, against her sternum. Her hands tightened slightly on the tray. She thought about Marcus, drunk in the service hallway. She thought about her rent, due in 11 days. She thought about the particular expression on the floor manager's face when he'd put the tray in her hands, the expression that said, "You are replaceable, and we both know it." She thought about the argument, which she had in fact been listening to, because she always listened even when she was pretending not to. The flag wasn't the problem, she said. The words came out quieter than she intended. What was that? Crow said. The customs flag. She kept her voice level. It was triggered by a documentation discrepancy, but the discrepancy was downstream of the actual error. If the Bremerhaven routing certificate listed the transfer as a secondary shipment on a primary manifest instead of a standalone declaration, the flag would have fired regardless of who filed what. The activation was automatic. You'd have hit it either way. Nobody spoke. Dante Farrow's expression had changed into something she couldn't read. The older man with the red face had gone very still. You'd have hit it either way, she said again, because the silence felt like it needed something in it. Because the manifest structure for that route requires primary classification on anything over 90,000 metric tons. The weight of the transfer triggered the secondary protocol. That's not a human error, that's a structural one. The fight you're having right now is about who stepped on the landmine, but the landmine was always going to be there. Elias Crow had not moved. He was looking at her with those gray eyes, and there was something in them now that was different from what had been there before, something that had shifted slightly and quietly the way a very large animal shifts its weight. Where did you learn that? He said. I read a lot. Shipping manifests. I read everything. She paused. Sir? Dante Farrow put down his drink. Who are you? I work here. That's not an answer. My name is Serafina Vale. I clean rooms on the 31st through 35th floors. Tonight I'm covering cocktail service because the regular server is, she stopped, recalibrated, unavailable. How old are you? 24. Dante looked at Crow. Something passed between them that she couldn't parse. Then the older red-faced man spoke for the first time since she'd approached. His voice was low and careful, and she could hear that he was someone who had learned over a very long life to be careful with his voice. If what she's saying is accurate, the Bremerhaven loss is nobody's fault. The loss is still $312 million, Dante said flatly. Fault doesn't make it smaller. No, Serafina said before she could stop herself, but it changes what you do next. Both men looked at her. She felt the room's attention like a physical pressure. She'd gone too far already. She knew that. She was going to lose this job and possibly something worse, and the part of her brain that had spent 24 years learning to keep quiet was screaming at the part that had spent the same 24 years noticing patterns, and neither part was winning cleanly. If it's a structural error in the manifest protocol, she said carefully, the 312 million isn't gone. It's blocked. Customs holds are different from confiscations. If you can demonstrate that the manifest discrepancy was a classification error rather than a filing violation, you have a recovery window. Complete silence. How long? Dante said. Depends on the jurisdiction. Bremerhaven is German customs under EU framework. Standard administrative review for classification disputes is 60 to 90 days. If the original shipment documentation is clean on every other variable, which it sounds like it is, you're looking at a 70 to 80% recovery rate on the held assets. The number she was improvising slightly. The framework was real. She'd spent 6 weeks reading EU customs law during a period of her life when she'd had nothing better to do and a library card and a particular kind of hunger for information that didn't care what the information was about. Elias Crow stood up. He was taller than she'd realized, and the way he stood made the space around him reorganize slightly. He looked at her for a long time with those gray, weathered eyes, and she held very still the way you hold still when something large and quiet is making a decision. Sit down, he said. Sir, I wasn't asking. He turned to the room. Everyone clear the platform. The men on the platform moved. They moved quickly and without argument, which told her something about who Elias Crow was, though she didn't have the full vocabulary for it yet. Bring her a chair, Crow said, and someone get Marchetti on the phone. Serafina stood with her tray and her champagne glasses while a chair materialized from somewhere and was placed on the now empty platform under the single overhead light, and she thought, very clearly, that this was the part where she should set the tray down on a table and walk back to the elevator and take it down 43 floors and go home and not come back. She thought about that. She thought about it very concretely, the shape of the exit, the distance to the elevator, the particular feeling of a decision that can't be undone. Then Dante Ferro pulled the chair back slightly and gestured at it, not politely, not impolitely, just with the flat efficiency of a man who did not repeat himself. She set the tray on the nearest table. She walked to the chair. She sat down. The next 2 hours were the strangest of her life. Men came to the platform one at a time or in small groups, and they talked to her about their operations the way you talk to a doctor about a symptom, half reluctant and half desperate. And she listened and asked questions when she didn't have enough information, and kept her voice quiet and even when she did. She talked about a supply chain bottleneck in a Pacific distribution network, and how the bottleneck moved during monsoon season. She talked about a real estate holding structure that was bleeding money through 3 layers of management fees that nobody had noticed were compounding. She talked about a communication gap between 2 subsidiary operations that was creating a pricing conflict neither side knew about. She didn't know where any of it was coming from exactly. She'd read about all of it in the way she read about everything, absorbing patterns the way other people absorbed weather, noticing the shape of how things connected and why they failed and what the failure looked like from the outside, before the inside knew it was coming. She'd done it her whole life without a name for it, without ever understanding that it was unusual. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, she became aware that the energy of the room had changed again. It had started as curiosity. She could feel that early, the particular texture of a room that is curious about something, slightly skeptical, waiting to be proven wrong. Then the texture had shifted into something more focused, more attentive, and now it had shifted again into something she didn't have a precise word for, something that was watching her the way you watch something valuable that you are considering how to possess. Elias Crow had not left the room. He'd moved to a chair near the wall where he sat and observed everything with those gray flat eyes and drank the same drink he'd had at the beginning of the evening. The man beside him, younger, with a stillness that was different from Crow's, a stillness that felt like something suppressed rather than something natural, leaned over and spoke into Crow's ear. Crow listened without moving, then nodded once. The younger man's name, she'd learn eventually, was Lucien Voss. He hadn't approached her yet. He hadn't asked her anything. He was just watching. And something about the quality of his watching was different from everyone else's, different enough that she noticed it even through everything else she was managing, the way you notice a sound that doesn't fit the room you're in. It was almost midnight when the bidding started. She didn't understand at first what was happening. There was a conversation she wasn't fully part of, words like access and arrangement and exclusive consultation. And then Dante Ferro was standing at the edge of the platform and looking at her with a kind of flat directness. The parties present would like to discuss a retainer structure, he said. A retainer structure, she repeated. Monthly, for advisory services. I'm a hotel maid. You were a hotel maid, he said it without inflection. The question is what you want to be next. The room was very quiet. All those eyes again. Serafina sat in the chair under the single overhead light and felt the shape of the thing that was happening, the way you feel the shape of a door in the dark before you can see it. Something was closing behind her. She couldn't hear it yet, but she could feel the air pressure change. How much? She heard herself ask. Dante told her a number. She kept her face neutral. Inside, something lurched sideways. That's a monthly figure, he said. She said nothing. There are 6 parties in this room with the resources to make that offer, he continued. Several of them are considering a competitive structure. You mean an auction? I mean a conversation about mutual benefit. From across the room, Elias Crow's voice came without him moving. Don't talk around it, Pharaoh. Dante's jaw tightened. A bid structure. Yes. Serafina looked at the room. 60 people, chandeliers, serious money, and that watchful smell underneath. The velvet platform under her. She had been sitting in this chair for 3 hours. She had an 11-day rent deadline and a job she was certainly going to be fired from, and a very specific understanding, suddenly, crystalline and cold, that the door she'd felt closing behind her in the dark had already closed. Not all the way, but enough. She opened her mouth to say something. She wasn't sure what. She hadn't decided. When a phone rang, it was Crow's phone. He looked at the screen and something moved across his face. Very small, very fast. Something that in any other human face she might have read as alarm. He stood up. We need to pause, he said to the room. We're in the middle of... Dante started. We need to pause, Crow said again. And his voice had a different texture now. And the room responded to that texture the way the platform men had responded to his earlier command. He stepped away from the room, phone to his ear. In the silence that followed, Serafina sat in her chair and listened to the room breathe, and she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. Something in the way the 6 or 7 most senior men were suddenly looking at each other with a very specific kind of careful expression. Not at her, at each other. The way people look at each other when they've just remembered a secret they thought was buried. She didn't know what it meant yet. She was very good at noticing patterns, and she had no idea yet what this one was, because she didn't have enough data points, because the data points were still assembling themselves in a room she didn't have full visibility into. But she felt it, the way you feel something wrong in a room before you can name it. Crow came back in. He stood at the edge of the platform and looked at her, and his face was back to its usual flatness, but his eyes had shifted somehow, something behind them that hadn't been there before. Change of schedule, he said to the room. We have a situation. What kind of situation? Dante said. Crow looked at him for a beat. Then he looked at Serafina. The kind, he said, that she's going to help us with. He set a tablet on the edge of the platform and turned it toward her. A single document, columns of numbers and routing codes and dates, dense and layered, and she scanned it in the first few seconds and felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Because she recognized the pattern. She had seen pieces of it, fragments, in the individual conversations she'd had over the past 3 hours. A structural anomaly here, a routing discrepancy there, a financial gap that didn't match the stated cause. She'd noticed each one separately. She hadn't understood until right now that they were the same shape. Someone had built them to be the same shape. Someone had built all of this. Who put this together? She said. That's what we need to know, Crow said. and Dante Ferro across the platform had gone absolutely white. Dante Ferro's face stayed white for exactly 3 seconds, and then something closed over it like a shutter dropping, and he was smooth again, composed, the kind of compose that takes years of practice to achieve and still costs something every time. "I want to see the sourcing on this document," he said. "You'll see what I decide to show you," Crow said. "Elias, sit down, Dante." The room had rearranged itself without anyone visibly moving. The clustering had shifted, the small gravitational pulls between bodies realigning around this new event, and Serafina sat in her chair on the platform and watched it happen and kept her breathing even and her hand still in her lap. The tablet was still in front of her. She looked at it again. The document was 41 pages. She'd absorbed maybe 6 in the 30 seconds she'd had with it. Enough to see the shape, enough to understand what she was looking at the way you understand the shape of a building from its foundation even before the walls go up. Someone had constructed an architecture of loss. That was the only way she could frame it. A deliberate, careful, multi-year architecture of small failures, each one engineered to look organic, each one positioned to cost a different party, just enough money that they'd look at the person standing next to them instead of looking at the structure itself. The Bremerhaven transfer. The Pacific bottleneck she'd discussed earlier. The real estate holding hemorrhage. 3 separate disasters, 3 separate rooms full of people blaming each other. Same blueprint, different walls. "How long?" she said. Crow looked at her. "What?" "How long has this been running?" She kept her voice flat. Not a performance of calm. She was genuinely calm, the way she got calm when a problem had enough shape to hold on to. "The earliest data point I can see in this section is 14 months ago, but the structure is too refined for 14 months. This took longer to build than that. I'm asking how long you've known about it." The room was very quiet. Crow studied her. "We didn't know about it." "Then how did you get this document?" A pause, long enough to mean something. "It was delivered," he said. "To you specifically." "To several of us. Tonight. Within the last hour." Serafina looked up from the tablet. She scanned the room. Not quickly, not anxiously, the way she moved through the ballroom with the tray, reading distances and geometries. The men who were watching her. The men who were watching each other. The men who were watching the door. "Whoever sent it wanted you to see it here," she said. "Together. In the same room." Nobody answered. "That matters," she said. "That's not incidental. Whoever built this structure, they wanted you to find out about it in a specific context. A context where you'd have witnesses, where you'd have immediate suspects." She paused. "Where you'd already be angry about $312 million. Dante Ferro moved. He walked to the platform edge and stood there with his arms at his sides and looked at her, and she could see that the white had come back underneath his composure. Not on the surface, but beneath it, the way cold comes through a wall. "You're saying this is a setup," he said. "I'm saying the delivery method is intentional. I don't know yet if it's a setup or an exposure. There's a difference." She looked at the tablet. "Can I see the rest of this?" Crow took the tablet, swiped something, handed it back. She read. The room waited. She was aware of the waiting the way you're aware of weather, as a condition of the space she was in, pressing slightly. She ignored it. She moved through the document the way she moved through everything, not linearly but structurally, looking for the load-bearing pieces, the places where the architecture depended on a specific assumption being true. She found it on page 23. A routing code. Small. Embedded in a transfer notation that would look like boilerplate to anyone not looking for it specifically. She almost missed it herself, and she wasn't sure she'd have caught it if she hadn't spent 3 hours earlier tonight hearing fragments of the same pattern in different voices. "There's a signature," she said. "What kind of signature?" Crow said. "A routing identifier. It's been modified. The last 4 digits are transposed, which is why it wouldn't flag in a standard audit. But the base code is consistent across every transaction in this document." She turned the tablet so he could see the page. "Every single one. 14 months of transactions across 6 different operations, and the same base identifier runs through all of them." Crow looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. "That's an internal code," he said. "I know." That means whoever built this had access to internal systems. Yes. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones before it. It had a texture to it, something serrated. Across the room, a man she hadn't focused on before stood up. He was maybe 60, lean, with a face that had been angular once and now was just tight, and he wore his tuxedo with the ease of someone who'd spent decades in formal clothes and stopped noticing them. "Which systems?" he said. His voice was very controlled, the kind of controlled that doesn't come naturally. "I don't know yet," Serafina said. "I'd need more data." "That routing code structure." He crossed the room slowly, not toward her specifically, but toward the platform, moving the way people move when they're trying to look casual and aren't quite making it. "Where is it issued from?" "The base format looks like it originates from a clearinghouse system, the kind used for multi-party financial transfers where you need a common identifier that all parties can validate independently." "A neutral clearinghouse." "That's what the format suggests." "Yes." He stopped a few feet from the platform and looked at her with those tight, angular eyes, and she could see him calculating something, the same way she calculated things, and the recognition of it was uncomfortable in a way she didn't have words for. "There are 3 clearinghouse systems with that code architecture," he said. 2 are institutional, 1 is private." "Which private one?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at Crow instead. Crow said, "Harlan." The lean man, Harlan, looked back at her. "The Meridian Clearinghouse. It was established 8 years ago as a neutral processing entity for parties who required discretion in large transfers." "Who owns it?" Another pause. "Nobody knows," Harlan said. "That's the point of it." Serafina set the tablet down on her knee. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, not because there was anything to see there, but because sometimes she needed to look at something without information in it while she assembled what she had. A neutral entity. 8 years. Nobody knows who owns it. "How many of the operations in this room have used the Meridian Clearinghouse?" she said. The silence answered before anyone did. She looked around. The expressions on the faces in the room had the particular quality of people who have just realized that a conversation has moved into territory they didn't consent to enter. "Everyone," she said. Not a question. Nobody confirmed it. Nobody denied it. "Okay," she said. She stood up. The room watched her stand. She walked to the edge of the platform and looked out at the assembled faces. 60 people, the architecture of serious power arranged in cocktail clusters, and felt something that wasn't fear and wasn't confidence, but was the particular sensation of understanding something that you cannot ununderstand once you've seen it. "Someone built a financial infrastructure that all of you depended on without knowing you depended on it," she said, "and they built it specifically to be the kind of thing you'd use without questioning because it did exactly what you needed and asked nothing obvious in return." She paused. "For 8 years, they have had full visibility into every major transaction every operation in this room has made. Every routing path, every counterparty, every amount. The losses you've been blaming on each other are withdrawals. Someone has been collecting, quietly, for a very long time." A sound from the back of the room, not a voice, just movement, the particular sound of a chair moving back fast. And then a low voice said something she didn't catch, and another voice answered it, sharper. Dante Ferro hadn't moved. He was standing at the platform edge, and his face had settled into something that wasn't composed anymore. It was just still, the way things are still when they've stopped moving, rather than when they were never moving. "The document that was delivered," he said, "was it delivered to expose this person, or to frame someone in this room for what they did?" "Both, possibly," Serafina said. "Or neither. There's a third option, which is, whoever sent it wants you at each other's throats. The document doesn't identify the broker." She used the word without thinking, the word that had appeared once in the document's header, and that she'd absorbed without marking it consciously. "But it creates enough ambiguity that every person in this room is going to spend the next 48 hours suspecting every other person, which means nobody is looking for the actual source." Harlan said very quietly, "You said the broker." "It's in the document header." "No," Harlan said. "It isn't." She looked at him. That word, he said, is not in that document. She picked up the tablet. She went back to the header. She read it twice. He was right. It wasn't there. She'd heard it. She was certain she'd read it. She'd absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, visually, structurally. And it wasn't on the page. Someone said it earlier, she said. In the room, someone used that word. The silence was very complete. She looked at the faces. 60 people. She hadn't been watching all of them when she'd been reading. She'd been watching the document, and the word had reached her as ambient sound, as background, and she'd processed it as belonging to the text, because that was how her brain worked, layering inputs, and she'd been wrong to... "I said it," said a voice from the side of the room. She turned. Lucien Voss was standing up. He'd been sitting in that chair by the wall for the entire evening. She'd been aware of him the whole time. The quality of his watching was too distinct to lose track of, even peripherally. But he hadn't spoken, hadn't moved to the platform, hadn't sent anyone to bring her a question. He'd just watched. He was younger than most of the men in the room, late 30s maybe, or early 40s in the way that some people are early 40s, not aged into it, but arrived there, with a face that had specific history in it without advertising what the history was. He was lean rather than heavy, and he wore the tuxedo the way Serafina wore her uniform, functionally, without relationship to it. He walked to the platform. He didn't gesture her off it. He stepped up beside her and stood there and looked at the room, not at her. And there was something in the ease of it that was more unsettling than any of the overt power in the room had been. "I used the word 20 minutes ago," he said to the assembled group, talking to Crow. She overheard it and stored it, and it surfaced in her analysis without her knowing where it came from. He looked at her then, not in a way that asked for confirmation, in a way that stated the thing and waited to see if she'd correct it. She didn't correct it, because it was right. "The broker is a name that's been in circulation for about 3 years," Lucien said, "in very specific circles, among people who had experienced what sounded like orchestrated bad luck, losses that were too precisely timed, betrayals that were too convenient, information leaks that benefited a party that wasn't visible in the original transaction." He paused. "Nobody had enough of a pattern to call it anything other than rumor. Until tonight." "You knew about this coming in," Crow said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was too flat for an accusation." "I suspected," Lucien said. "Knowing requires evidence." "And now you have it. Now we have the beginning of it." Dante Ferro said, "You should have disclosed this before the evening began." Lucien looked at him. The look had no particular content. "You're right," he said, and the agreement landed harder than a denial would have because it didn't move anywhere. It just sat there. The argument that had wanted to happen didn't happen. Dante looked away first. Serafina watched this and filed it and looked back at the document and thought about the routing code and the 8 years and the things she hadn't said yet, because she didn't know how to say it without making the room do something she wasn't prepared to manage. "There's something else," she said. Lucien looked at her. "The signature code. The base identifier." She held the tablet up. "I said it runs through every transaction in this document. That's true. But there's one transaction where it doesn't appear." The room stilled. "One transfer, page 31, dated 8 months ago, processed through the Meridian system without the identifier, which means it was either an error, the signature was accidentally omitted, or it was intentional. And if it was intentional, it means whoever processed that specific transfer knew the identifier was a tell, which means they'd seen what I saw tonight." "Someone inside," Harlan said. "Someone who has access to the Meridian system and noticed the pattern and was careful about one specific transaction and not the others." She put the tablet down. "Which means either they got sloppy for 13 months in either direction, or the slip was intentional, and that transaction is the one they wanted someone to eventually find." "A breadcrumb," Lucien said, "or a trap." She looked at page 31. The transaction was for a relatively small amount compared to the others, 4 million, routed through a subsidiary account attached to a property holding in a city she didn't recognize. The notation was minimal. The counterparty was listed only as a reference number. "I need access to the Meridian system," she said. Harlan laughed. It came out wrong, too short, catching in his throat. Nobody has access to the Meridian system except through registered accounts. Then I need access to a registered account. That requires clearance authorization from the account holder. She looked at the room. How many account holders are in this room right now? The silence. Then 6 hands went up. Not all at once. One at a time, reluctant, the way you raise your hand when you've already accepted you're going to do the thing, and the reluctance is just form. She looked at Lucian. He hadn't raised his hand. She looked at Crow. He hadn't either. She looked at Harlan. Harlan's hand was the last to go up. It went up slow, like a flag in no wind, and his face when it was up looked like someone who had just made a decision they knew was going to cost them. Okay, she said. I need 30 minutes and a clean device. Lucian said, You'll get 20. She almost pushed back. She looked at him and saw in his face that the 20 wasn't negotiation. It was information about something else, some timeline she didn't have visibility into yet. And she stopped. 20, she said. The device appeared. She sat back down in the chair. The room didn't disperse. The room stayed exactly where it was, 60 people breathing in the same space, and she could feel the pressure of it at her back as she worked, the gathering weight of a situation that had already passed the point where any individual decision could reverse it. She was on page 6 of the Meridian System's internal logs when the first shot broke the window. Not inside the room. Outside. Somewhere below. From the street, and the sound of it came up through the glass like a physical force, and the room fractured instantly, bodies moving, voices crossing, the specific chaos of people who handled danger for a living suddenly being inside it without preparation. Lucien was beside her before she registered him moving, not touching her, a foot away, angled between her and the window, and she looked at his face and saw that it had gone very quiet in the way faces go quiet when the brain has switched modes completely. We need to move, he said. I'm not finished. We need to move right now. She looked at the screen. She'd found the page 31 transaction in the system logs. She'd found the reference number. She'd started to run the reverse trace on the counterparty account. She'd found a name. She hadn't finished reading it. Give me 10 seconds, she said. Serafina. She read it. She read it twice because the first time didn't make sense, and the second time didn't make it make more sense. It just made it more certain. She picked up the tablet. She looked at Lucian. The counterparty account on the page 31 transaction, she said. The one without the signature code. The breadcrumb. She kept her voice very even. It's registered to a shell entity. But the authorization signature on the account creation, she turned the tablet so he could see the screen, matches a registration code from 8 years ago. He read it. His face did something very small and very controlled that she was only able to read because she'd been watching him all evening. That's Harlan's code, he said. She looked across the room to where Harlan had been standing. Harlan was gone. The door to the service corridor, the door she'd come through herself hours ago, with her tray and her even breath and her invisible posture, was swinging slowly shut behind where he'd been standing, and the room was still fracturing around the sound of the shot from below, and nobody had noticed yet, nobody except her and Lucian and the slowly closing door, and she understood in that moment with absolute clarity that she was never going to get on that elevator and go back down to the 31st floor. Not tonight. Not ever. He's running, she said. Yes, Lucian said. If he runs, we lose the thread. Yes. She stood up. Then we can't let him run. Lucian looked at her for 1 second, a measuring look, not the kind that doubts, the kind that calculates. And then he was moving, and she was moving with him, and behind them the room was finally noticing the closed door, and voices were rising, and someone was shouting Harlan's name, and outside, far below, the city was doing whatever cities do when something has already gone wrong, and the people inside the buildings don't know it yet. The service corridor was narrow and badly lit. Fluorescent strips overhead that buzzed at a frequency Serafina felt in her back teeth, and she was running in low heels on a concrete floor, which was not a situation she had ever specifically planned for, but here it was. Lucian was ahead of her by 4 steps. He moved like someone who had run through corridors before, not sprinting, controlled, hugging the right wall, and she matched his pace without being told to because the geometry of it was obvious. The corridor branched left 30 feet ahead. He took the branch without slowing. Behind them, the ballroom was audible as sound without specifics. Voices, movement, the particular frequency of a room that has stopped being a room and started being a situation. "He knows this building," she said. "He's stayed here before." Lucien didn't look back. "3 times that I know of. He uses the same suite. He walks the exits." "You knew that coming in." "I know things about a lot of people." They hit a stairwell door. He pushed it open and held it, and she went through and he followed, and the door closed behind them with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Stairs going down, concrete walls painted industrial gray. A railing on one side, cold under her hand. She could hear footsteps below. Not close, maybe 4 or 5 floors down, moving fast. "He's going for the garage," she said. "Sub-level 2. Lucien was already moving down, hand trailing the rail, eyes on the stairwell below. "There's a private exit from the garage to the east alley. He'll have a car there, or he'll call one." "How much head start does he have?" 3 minutes. Maybe 3.5. She did the math on the stairs. Sub-level 2 from 43 was a long way down if you took the stairs. Not as long if there was another elevator. "Is there a freight elevator?" 29th floor junction, but he'd have to backtrack. She thought about Harlan. The way his hand had gone up last, slow as a flag and no wind, when she'd asked about Meridian accounts. The way his face had looked when it was up. Not reluctant the way people are reluctant when they don't want to do something, but reluctant the way people are reluctant when they've decided, and the decision is already costing them in a way they're pretending to feel rather than actually feeling. She'd read it wrong. She'd read it as genuine reluctance. As a man raising his hand because he'd accepted he was going to do a difficult thing. It was performance. The whole thing was performance. He'd raised his hand so she'd ask for access. So she'd use his account to get into the Meridian system. So whatever trace she left inside those logs would be attached to a session authorized by her using credentials he'd provided. And when anyone looked at who had accessed that page 31 transaction tonight, she stopped on the landing between 38 and 37. Lucien stopped 2 steps below her and looked up. "He didn't run because I found the code," she said. Lucien waited. "He ran because I was about to finish reading it. The registration code, the one attached to his account. If I'd had 10 more seconds, I'd have seen what came after it. He needed me to stop before I saw the rest." "What's the rest?" "I don't know. I didn't get 10 more seconds." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Keep moving." She kept moving. They hit sub-level 2 at a dead run, and the door from the stairwell opened into a concrete space that smelled like oil and exhaust and cold. The garage running low and gray under industrial lighting, rows of vehicles and support columns, and the particular acoustic flatness of underground space. Lucien had a phone out. He said 2 words into it that she didn't catch and then put it back. She was scanning the garage. Sub-level 2, private section. She could see the division markers on the floor, the transition from standard parking to the kind of spaces that came with the premium floors. Wider. Fewer cars. A corridor at the far end that would lead to the east alley exit. Movement. Not Harlan. 2 men moving fast from the east corridor entrance, converging toward a dark gray sedan in the 3rd row. One of them was talking into something at his collar. The other had his hand inside his jacket. Security. Not hotel security. The wrong posture, the wrong shoes, the wrong specific quality of attention. "Those aren't yours," she said. "No." Lucien had seen them before she spoke. "Get behind the column." She got behind the column. What happened in the next 40 seconds she processed in fragments rather than sequence. Sounds she could identify. Sounds she couldn't. The specific echo of a concrete space doing things to noise that open spaces don't do. She pressed her back against the column and breathed through her nose and counted the things she knew. 2 men, professional, heading for the sedan. Harlan presumably already in the east corridor or past it. A car waiting or not waiting. A city outside that didn't know any of this was happening. Lucien's voice from somewhere to her left. "Clear." She came out from behind the column. One of the 2 men was on the ground. Not dead. She could see the rise and fall of his chest from 20 feet away, but down and staying down. The other was gone. The sedan's driver window was broken, glass across the concrete floor. Lucien was walking toward her with his jacket slightly adjusted and his face exactly as it had been before, which was the thing that unsettled her most. Not what had just happened, but the fact that his face looked the same on the other side of it. "Who were they?" she said. "They were here for him, not for us." He moved past her toward the east corridor. "That changes the timeline." "How?" "Someone else knows Harlan is running, someone who wants to make sure he doesn't talk before they've contained what he knows." He reached the corridor entrance and stopped, checking the angle, then went through. She followed. "Which means we have less time than 3 minutes. We have however long it takes his people to realize those two didn't make contact." The east corridor was narrow, service lighting, pipes along the ceiling, 40 feet to the alley door which was standing open. They went through. The alley was wet from earlier rain, puddles black under the single lamp mounted above the hotel's east exit. It was empty. No car. No Harlan. At the alley's far end, maybe 60 feet away, a gate to the street, closed. The latch was swinging. "He's through," she said. Lucien was already moving. They hit the street and the city opened up around them. Traffic sound, distant, the specific nighttime frequency of a city that was never actually quiet. The block was commercial, mostly dark at this hour, a few lit windows above closed storefronts. Harlan was half a block north, moving fast for a 60-year-old, his tuxedo jacket gone, white dress shirt bright under the street lamps. Lucien said something under his breath. Then he ran. Serafina ran too because standing still wasn't an option and going back was less of one. And the heels were a genuine problem on wet pavement, but she'd solved worse problems with less. And she wasn't going to stop now. Harlan heard them. He looked back once, his face white and angular in the streetlight. The tightness in it now something different, something that had abandoned the shape of control entirely. And then he turned a corner. They turned after him. The side street was darker, narrower. Harlan was 20 feet ahead and slowing, not giving up, flagging, his age and the stairs catching up to him. He hit a chain-link fence at the street's dead end and grabbed it with both hands, and for a moment she thought he was going to try to climb it, 60 years old in dress shoes, and then he turned around. He had a phone in his hand. He looked at her. Not at Lucien, at her. "You don't understand what you found," he said. He was breathing hard, each word costing him something. "Then explain it to me," she said. "It's not. The code isn't what you think it is." "What is it?" He looked at Lucien and something shifted in his face. An appeal or a calculation, she couldn't tell which. "Voss, you know how this works. You know that sometimes the structure exists to serve a purpose that isn't visible in the structure." "Tell her," Lucien said. His voice was completely neutral. "Harlan." She took one step toward him, not threatening. She wasn't capable of threatening in the way the men in the ballroom were threatening, and she knew it, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "The page 31 transaction. What's after the registration code?" He looked at her. "What didn't I get to finish reading?" she said. The phone in his hand. He was gripping it like it was the only solid object in a room full of things that had stopped being solid. "You're 24 years old," he said. "Yes." "You walked into that ballroom tonight with a tray of drinks." "Yes." "You have no idea." He stopped. He looked at the fence behind him and then at Lucien and then back at her. "The registration code is dual signed. My code is the first signature, but account creation in the Meridian system requires 2 authorizations. There's a second signature." She went very still. "Whose?" she said. He said a name. She heard it. She processed it. She ran it against every conversation she'd had in the past 4 hours. Every voice, every face, every moment of explanation or question or silence. And she found the name in exactly 2 places, both of which she'd accepted without examination because she'd been focused on other things. The name was Elias Crow. "No," she said. Not denial. Reflex. "Crow co-signed the Meridian account creation 8 years ago," Harlan said. "He is not the broker. He is the broker's oldest and most protected investor. He has known about this operation from the beginning. He finally lowered the phone slightly, the grip loosening just enough to be visible. The document that was delivered tonight, the one he showed you. He delivered it himself, to himself and the others. He brought you up to that platform because he needed someone with no history in this world to find the pattern so that none of the other parties could claim the analysis was compromised. She thought about Crow's gray eyes, the particular quality of his watching, the way he'd stopped her with 2 fingers. You, the authority of it, not the brutality. She thought about how he'd handed her the tablet, the way you hand someone a tool you've already decided they're going to use. He used me, she said. He needed clean hands for the analysis. Yours were the cleanest in the room. Why? What does he get from the other parties seeing the pattern? The broker has been extracting from everyone for 8 years, Harlan said, including Crow. But Crow found out 6 months ago. He's been building a case, assembling the document, mapping the network. Tonight he needed witnesses to the revelation. People who saw the evidence surface organically, analyzed by a neutral party. His voice had steadied somewhat, the fear shading into something else, something that sounded almost like exhaustion underneath. He needed the other syndicate leaders to see it and believe it so that when he moves against the broker, he has the backing of everyone in that room. And Harlan, Lucian said. He hadn't moved from the entrance to the dead-end street. His voice was the same temperature it had been all evening. What's your role in this? Harlan looked at him. You co-signed the account, Lucian said. You're not Crow's partner or you'd have stayed in that room. So what are you? Harlan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they had a quality she hadn't seen in them before. Not calculation, not control, something that was simply worn. I built the Meridian system, he said, 12 years ago. I designed the architecture, the clearinghouse, the identifier codes, the routing structure. All of it. He paused. I sold it 8 years ago to a party I didn't investigate as thoroughly as I should have. And I co-signed the account creation because they told me it was a standard authorization requirement. And I believed them. He looked at his hands. I didn't know what it was being used for until 3 years ago. And when you found out, Serafina said, when I found out I was too embedded to extract without destroying myself along with it. He said it flat, no self-pity, just the shape of it. So I stayed, and I watched, and I kept records of everything. She looked at him. The page 31 transaction, she said slowly. The one without the identifier. You processed that deliberately. I needed someone to eventually find a clean thread that led back to the account creation. Something that would survive whatever Crow or the broker or anyone else tried to bury. He met her eyes for the first time without any of the earlier layering over it. I didn't know it would be a hotel maid with a tray of champagne, but I'm not sorry it was. She stood in the wet alley with her heels and her borrowed cocktail uniform, and the city making its nighttime sounds around them, and thought about the shape of the thing she was standing inside. Crow had used her as a clean instrument. Harlan had built a breadcrumb for an unknown future investigator. The broker had spent 8 years turning everyone's money into their own, and she had walked into the 43rd floor at 10 p.m. to cover for a drunk colleague, and somehow ended up at the junction of all 3 trajectories, the point where they all converged, which was not a position she'd chosen and was not a position she could unchoose. The records you kept, she said. Where are they? Harlan's jaw tightened. Safe. Not good enough. Where? Why does that matter to you? Because if Crow is moving against the broker tonight, he needs those records to do it cleanly. Without them, whatever he's planning is going to look like one crime organization attacking another. With them, it's documented exposure. There's a difference in what happens after. She took another step toward him. The people who came through the garage tonight, the 2 men at the sedan, they weren't Crow's. They weren't yours. Whose were they? Harlan looked at Lucien. Lucien said nothing. Whose were they, Harlan? The broker knows, Harlan said. Not about the document, not yet, but they know I've been building something. They've known for about 6 weeks. I've been managing the pressure. He said the last part with a specific exhaustion that told her the managing had not been going well. Those men weren't sent to stop me talking. They were sent to retrieve the records before I could transfer them. Then they already know where the records are. They know where I stored them 3 weeks ago. Something moved across his face. I moved them last Tuesday. To where? He was quiet. Harlan. Her voice came out harder than she'd intended. Not a performance. She was tired and her feet hurt, and she was standing in a wet alley at midnight in someone else's uniform, and she was done with the pace of information being handed to her in pieces. The broker sent people to this building tonight. Crow triggered a revelation in that ballroom that is going to accelerate whatever timeline is already running. Those 2 men are going to fail to check in, and whoever sent them is going to send more. We are standing in an alley right now, and I need to know where the records are. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The Meridian system itself." She stared at him. "I hid them inside the system's own archival structure," he said, "embedded in the maintenance logs. The layer of the system that nobody audits because it looks like automated housekeeping data." He almost smiled. It didn't make it to his face properly. Hidden in the thing they think they own. Serafina turned and looked at Lucien. Lucien was looking back at her with an expression that she was beginning to understand was his version of urgency, not visible on the surface, just present in the angle of his body, the particular set of his shoulders. "We need to go back," she said. "Yes. Crow is going to make his move tonight. If he moves before we can get those records out of the system and into a format that doesn't disappear when the broker realizes the system is compromised, then everything Harlan built over 3 years disappears with it," Lucien said. "Yes." She turned back to Harlan. "Can you extract it remotely?" "I need a secure access point, a device that isn't connected to anything in the hotel's network." "How long?" "If the connection is clean, 20 minutes. She looked at Lucien. He was already pulling out his phone, and then her own thinking caught up to itself, the pattern recognition moving one step ahead the way it always did, and she felt the cold land in the center of her chest like something dropped from a height. She looked at Lucien. His phone was out. He was making a call. She thought about what Harlan had said. Crow found out 6 months ago. He's been building a case. She thought about what Lucien had said in the ballroom. "I suspected. Knowing requires evidence." She thought about the 2 men in the garage, the wrong posture, the wrong shoes. Not Crow's, not Harlan's. She thought about the fact that Lucien Voss had sat in that chair against the wall all evening and watched everything and said almost nothing, and had known the word broker before she said it, and had moved to her side the instant the shot broke the glass. Not toward the window, not toward the threat, to her side. "Lucien," she said. He looked up from the phone. "Who told you to come tonight?" she said. The alley was very quiet. His face did the thing it did. The small, controlled movement, contained before it could become readable. But this time she was watching for it, and she caught the half-second before the containment, the half-second where the expression was just an expression, and what she saw in it, what she saw in his face in that half-second before the containment came down was not guilt. It was grief, which was worse. Guilt meant he'd made a calculation and decided against her. Grief meant he'd made a calculation and decided against himself, against something he'd wanted to protect, and the decision had already been made before tonight, before the ballroom, before she'd ever stepped off that service elevator with her tray and her invisible posture, and he was standing in a wet alley looking at her with the remains of it in his face. "Lucien," she said again. He lowered the phone. "The broker," she said. "You know who it is." The alley, the wet pavement, Harlan against the chain-link fence with his hands at his sides, very still, watching the 2 of them the way you watch something that hasn't decided yet what it's going to do. "I've known for 8 months, Lucien said. She breathed through it. "And tonight was supposed to be a controlled exposure. Crow surfaces the document, you validate the pattern, the room turns against the broker, and the broker loses the protection of the network." He said it without inflection, the way you say something you've rehearsed so many times it's lost the texture of language and become just sound. The plan was to remove the infrastructure before the broker could collapse it. "Whose plan?" He didn't answer. "You said it was supposed to be controlled," she said. "What changed?" "You found the page 31 transaction faster than anyone anticipated." He looked at Harlan briefly. "And Harlan ran, which was not part of the plan." Harlan said, I ran because I saw her reading the account creation record, and I didn't know how much she'd seen. I didn't know if she'd seen the second name. The second name, Serafina said, and the cold in her chest relocated, shifted downward, settled somewhere deeper. You said Crow co-signed the account creation. You said his was the second signature. It is, Harlan said. She looked at Lucienne. Then what's the third? She said. He was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. The city made its sounds around the alley's edges. The Meridian account requires 2 authorizations to create, he said, but it requires 3 to access the archival layer. The maintenance logs where Harlan hid the records. He paused. My code is the 3rd. She stood in the wet alley, and the pieces finished assembling themselves in the particular way they assembled when she'd been holding fragments long enough, and suddenly the structure was just there, complete, the way a building is suddenly a building once you see it has a roof. Lucienne Voss, the Voss Consortium, 8 months of knowing, a 3rd signature on the deepest layer of a system built to be untraceable. You're not the broker, she said. She was certain of this. The grief in his face had been real, and grief is not the emotion of someone who has achieved what they wanted. No, he said, but you're close enough to them that you have access to the archival layer. I was given that access 3 years ago. As a gesture of trust, I was told. An invitation deeper into the relationship. He said the word relationship the way you say a word that has been corrupted past the point of usefulness. I understood later what it actually was. An insurance policy. If I ever moved against them, my access code in that layer would make me look like a co-architect. Which is why you needed the records to come out through a neutral party, she said. You couldn't extract them yourself without confirming the frame. Yes. And you needed someone to find the pattern in that ballroom tonight who had no connection to any of this, so that the discovery couldn't be challenged. She looked at him. You knew Crow was going to put me on that platform. I knew Crow was going to use whoever fell into his hands tonight. I didn't know it would be you specifically. He met her eyes and she looked at him, and it was the most direct thing that had happened between them all evening. No performance on either side, just the stripped-down fact of what the situation actually was. But once it was you, I needed it to stay you, because you're the only person in that building tonight whose analysis nobody can compromise. You have no history, no affiliation, no account in the Meridian system, no prior contact with any party in that room. He paused. You're the only clean thing left. From somewhere above and to the north came the sound of sirens. Not close yet. Moving in a direction that might or might not be toward them. Harlan pushed off the chain-link fence. We need to make a decision. She looked at him. The records in the archival layer, he said. Extracting them requires all 3 access codes entering simultaneously. Mine, Crow's, and Voss's. It was designed that way. The broker built it as a dead man's switch. If any single party tried to access the layer alone, it triggers a deletion protocol. Everything gone in 4 minutes. So you need Crow, she said. We need Crow. She looked at Lucian. Crow is in that ballroom, she said, running his controlled exposure that is no longer controlled. With Harlan gone, with shots fired, with 2 of the broker's men down in the garage. She stopped. How long before the broker knows tonight went wrong? They may already know, Lucian said. Then we have until they decide to trigger the deletion themselves. When they figure out that the exposure happened and the records are accessible and the 3 code holders are all in the same building, they will burn the system before we can extract anything. She was already moving, back toward the alley gate, back toward the hotel. How long does it take to trigger the deletion remotely? 60 seconds to authenticate and initiate, Harlan said, following. 4 minutes for the deletion to complete. And once it starts, it can't be stopped. No. Then we have a window of exactly as long as it takes the broker to decide the situation is unrecoverable. She pushed through the alley gate and hit the street and turned south toward the hotel's east entrance, which means we need to get Crow out of that ballroom and into a secure access point with a clean device in the next... How long do you think we have? Lucian, beside her now. 20 minutes. Maybe less. Then we run. They ran. The hotel's east entrance was a service door with a keypad, and Harlan had the code and they were through it in 15 seconds, and into the service corridor network that ran behind the hotel's public face, the skeleton of the building, pipes and conduit, and the particular smell of a large structure's hidden infrastructure. She'd spent 14 months in these corridors. She knew them in her body, in the reflex memory of someone who had walked them without thinking hundreds of times. 38th floor, she said. There's a server room off the maintenance junction. The network there is isolated from the hotel's main system. It's for building management only. If we can bridge from there into the Meridian system through Harlan's access, the connection won't be visible in the hotel's logs. How do you know about the server room? Lucienne said. I cleaned the corridor outside it twice a week for 6 months. The door has a glass panel. She hit the stairwell at a pace that was going to destroy her feet, and she didn't care. I paid attention. You pay attention to everything. Habit. She took the stairs 2 at a time, and her left heel cracked at the base, and she yanked both shoes off without stopping and ran in her stockings on cold concrete. It's how I survive. They came out on 38, and she led them left and then right, and then through a maintenance door that opened with a standard hotel key she still had on her lanyard from her actual job. Her real job. The one she was going to be fired from at some point tonight when anyone thought to remember she existed. The server room was 10 feet by 12, racks of equipment along 3 walls, a workstation in the corner that was used for building management monitoring, cold, loud with the sound of cooling systems, a single overhead light that buzzed like the corridor fluorescence. Harlan sat at the workstation. His hands were shaking slightly up. She could see it from 3 feet away, the tremor in his fingers as he woke the system. I need Crow, he said. I can't initiate without his code. I'll get him, Lucian said. You can't go back into that ballroom. I'm not going into the ballroom. He had his phone out. He was dialing. He held the phone to his ear and the call connected on the second ring, and he said, It's me. I need you to leave the room right now and come to the 38th floor maintenance junction. Come alone. A pause. Because the window is closing and I have the other 2 pieces you need. Another pause. Elias, now. He ended the call. He looked at Serafina. She was looking at the workstation screen where Harlan had navigated to the Meridian System's login architecture, the outer layer of it, the part that looked like any financial interface. Clean, professional, institutional. The kind of thing that told you nothing about what was underneath. When we get the records out, she said to Lucien, what happens to them? They go to people who can use them. Law enforcement. He was quiet a beat. Among others. That's not specific enough. No, it isn't. She looked at him. I need it to be specific, because whatever comes out of that archival layer is going to implicate people in that ballroom who were victims of this operation. And it's also going to implicate people who weren't. And the difference matters. The records need to go somewhere that can tell those 2 things apart. She paused. Otherwise, Crow controls the narrative. He decides who gets exposed and who gets protected, and we've just handed him the same instrument the broker's been using, with different hands. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. You think 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room, he said. I think about consequences, she said. It's not the same thing. It is, actually. The door opened and Elias Crow came through it. He looked at the 3 of them, Lucienne, Serafina, Harlan, at the workstation, and the gray eyes moved across the scene with the practiced speed of a man who had spent a lifetime reading rooms and making rapid assessments. He looked at Harlan last. You ran, Crow said. Yes, Harlan said. Stupid. Yes. Crow looked at Serafina. Something in his face shifted. Not quite what she'd call apology, nothing so direct as that, but an acknowledgement. The look of a man who has used something and knows it and is deciding how to account for it. You understand the full picture now. I understand your piece of it, she said. That's most of it. It's not all of it. She held his gaze. The records come out and they go to a neutral third party, not to you, not to anyone in that ballroom with a vested interest in controlling the outcome. A neutral channel with independent verification. Crow was quiet. That's my condition, she said. You're 24 years old and you were carrying a drink tray 4 hours ago. Yes, and I'm the only person in this room whose access code isn't in the Meridian system and whose name isn't in any of the records we're about to extract, which makes me the only person in this room who isn't buying myself a specific outcome by doing this. She didn't look away. So those are my conditions. Crow looked at Lucien. Lucien said nothing. Crow looked back at her. The gray eyes, flat and cold, and whatever was behind them that she'd been trying to read all evening. Agreed, he said. She didn't relax. She kept her breathing even and her posture neutral, and she did not feel the relief that wanted to surface, because the situation was not done, and relief was for when situations were done. Harlan's hands were on the keyboard. I need both codes simultaneously. Lucien first, then Elias within 3 seconds of each other. The system validates the timestamp on both entries. Lucien moved to the workstation, typed, stepped back. Crow moved to the workstation, typed. The screen changed. The archival layer opened like something unsealing, the interface shifting to an older architecture, something beneath the polish of the outer system, raw and dense and real, lines of data populating. Harlan's hands moving across the keyboard, fast, practiced, the shaking gone now that he was in familiar territory. 3 years, he said. Every transaction, every routing path, every counterparty. He was pulling files, compressing, his voice dropping to something almost private. Every name. Serafina watched the screen. The names appeared in batches as the files opened, and she scanned them the way she scanned everything, and she saw the pattern she'd been expecting and one name she hadn't been expecting, and she said, "Stop." Harlan stopped. She pointed at the screen. "That account," she said, "the one flagged as the primary beneficiary of the extraction mechanism. That's the broker's direct account, the one everything flows into at the end of every cycle." She looked at Crow. "You said you didn't know who the broker was." "I don't. That account has a beneficial ownership registration. It's required under the same EU framework as the Bremerhaven routing. There has to be a named individual attached to it." She leaned toward the screen. "Has anyone ever pulled the beneficial ownership record on that account?" Silence. She looked at Harlan. "Can you access it from here?" "If the registration is in the archival layer," he was already typing, "it would be in the compliance documentation folder." His hands slowed, then stopped. "It's here." "Open it." He opened it. The name on the beneficial ownership record was 3 words. She read them. She read them again. Then she heard Lucien make a sound beside her, very small, almost nothing. And she looked at him and saw that he'd gone the same kind of white Dante Faro had gone earlier in the evening, but differently, in a way that started somewhere internal and was moving outward. "You know this name," she said. He didn't answer. "Lucien, you know this name." "It's not possible," he said. Very quiet, very controlled. "That person has been dead for 2 years." Harlan slowly turned in his chair and looked at Lucien with an expression that was the closest thing to pity she'd seen on his face all night. "No," Harlan said. "They haven't." And the server room's cooling system hummed, and the overhead light buzzed, and Lucien Voss stood 6 inches from Serafina Vale in 10 square feet of cold electronic air, and she could feel from that 6 inches away the specific quality of a person whose entire framework for the past 2 years has just been surgically removed from under them. And she understood, without needing the name explained, without needing the history, just from the shape of his stillness, that whoever was named on that screen was someone he had loved or trusted, or both. And they had built the most sophisticated financial predation network in the criminal world, and then staged their own death to disappear inside it. Crow's voice from behind them both. "Who is it?" Serafina turned. She looked at Crow with his gray, flat eyes, and his expensive stillness, and the controlled exposure he'd engineered, and the plan that had been supposed to be clean and wasn't, that had never been going to be clean, that had required her in the center of it as the instrument of its apparent neutrality, and she looked at him and thought about conditions and agreements and the way power worked in a room where everyone had vested interests and only one person was holding a door open with nothing behind her worth protecting. She thought about the name on the screen. She thought about what happened when Crow knew it. She said, "Before I tell you, I need something from you that isn't a verbal agreement." Crow's eyes narrowed by approximately 1 millimeter. "We had an agreement. We had a conversation. An agreement has documentation." She turned back to the workstation. "Harlan, is there a way to flag a file in this system so that any attempt to delete it creates an automatic external transmission to a pre-designated address?" Harlan blinked. Yes. It's a tripwire function. It was built in as a failsafe for the original system design. I haven't thought about it in 10 years. Can you set it on the extraction package you just pulled? In about 4 minutes. Yes. Set it. She looked at Crow. The transmission address will be independent legal counsel with instructions to release to a journalist contact on receipt. If the records are deleted, suppressed, or modified after extraction, everything goes public automatically. She held his gaze. Now we have an agreement. Crow looked at her for a very long moment. The door of the server room rattled. Not Crow's people, not hotel staff. The sound was wrong for both. Too deliberate, too specific. The sound of someone who knew exactly which door they wanted. Lucien was already moving, angling away from the workstation, putting himself between the door and the rest of the room. His hand was inside his jacket. "How long for the tripwire?" Serafina said quietly. Harlan's fingers were moving. 3 minutes. "Lucien, 3 minutes." "I heard," he said. The door rattled again. Then a sound she'd heard once before tonight. A specific metallic precision. And Lucien said, very flat, "Get down." And she dropped behind the server rack and pulled Harlan off his chair and down with her. And the door came open in the server room. The door came open and there were 2 of them, and the server room was 10 feet by 12, and there was nowhere for anyone to go. Serafina was already down. Harlan beside her behind the rack, her hand on his arm, feeling through his sleeve the specific tremor of a 60-year-old man who has just understood that this is the version of the night where it ends badly. The workstation screen was still populated, the tripwire function half-built, Harlan's session open and blinking. 2 minutes, 40 seconds left. She was counting. Lucien didn't shoot first. She registered this. He had his hand inside his jacket, and he didn't draw, and the reason was geometry. 2 people in the doorway, close together, the angle between them and the server racks where she and Harlan were hidden was maybe 15 degrees. And if he fired and missed, or the shot went through, the rack was not protection. It was just metal between her and the result. The first man through the door was large, with the specific kind of bulk that isn't weight but density, and he had something in his hand that he kept low. The second was smaller, faster, already moving right to clear the entry angle. Lucien said, "Don't." His voice was the same temperature it had been all evening, which was the thing about him she'd noticed from the beginning and kept noticing. The refusal to let the register of his voice become a tool the situation could use. The large man stopped. Not because of the word, because Lucien had moved in the same moment he'd spoken, and the geometry of the room had changed, and the large man was processing the new geometry. "You have 30 seconds to tell me who sent you," Lucien said. "After that, the conversation is different." The large man looked at him. The smaller man to the right was still moving, slow and lateral, trying to open the angle. Lucien tracked him with his body without looking at him directly, the kind of peripheral awareness that came from something older than thought. Serafina looked at the workstation, the screen, the tripwire function. 2 minutes, 20 seconds in her count. She looked at Harlan. She held up 2 fingers. He understood. He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them, nodded once. She looked at the cable management panel on the back of the rack they were crouched behind. A thick bundle of cables running from the workstation to the rack's distribution unit. She reached into the gap between the rack and the wall, found the bundle, got both hands around it. Lucien was still talking. She wasn't following the words. She was watching the 2 men's feet, the only part of them she could see from her angle, and she counted in her head, and when she hit 90 seconds remaining, she pulled the cable bundle as hard as she could. The lights went out. Not all the lights. The overhead strip died. The server rack stayed on. It had its own power circuit. But the overhead fluorescent went black and the room dropped to the dim glow of indicator lights and the workstation screen, and that was enough of a difference that the large man made a sound and shifted his weight wrong, and Lucian moved. She felt more than saw it. Movement in the dark, the sound of impact, specific and purposeful, and then a heavier sound which was a body losing its relationship with upright, and then the smaller man's voice saying something sharp, and Lucien's voice responding, and something hitting the rack 2 feet from her head that was not a person. 40 seconds. She stood up. The smaller man was between her and the workstation. He was looking at something to his left, at Lucienne, and his profile was to her, and she had about 1 second before he recalibrated. She hit him with the monitor from the secondary terminal on the edge of the rack. Not with full force. She wasn't capable of full force, and she knew it. She wasn't performing capabilities she didn't have, but with the specific kind of impact that came from 44 pounds of equipment moving at speed from a direction he wasn't looking, which was enough. He went sideways into the rack, and the rack held, and he slid down it, and she stepped over him. Harlan was already at the workstation. His hands were moving. 20 seconds. Lucien appeared beside her from the dark, breathing hard for the first time all evening. Something on his face she couldn't see clearly in the indicator light glow. He looked at the workstation. He looked at her. "You hit him with a monitor," he said. "It was available." "Are you—" "I'm fine. Watch the door." He watched the door. Harlan typed. 10 seconds. 5. The screen changed. A single line of text appeared in the interface. Tripwire engaged. External transmission active. Harlan's hands dropped to his lap. He sat in the chair and breathed. Serafina looked at the screen for a long moment. The cursor blinked. The files were flagged. The transmission address was live. Anyone who touched the records now, deleted, modified, suppressed, would send 3 years of Harlan's documentation to an independent attorney and a journalist contact she'd given the address of 40 minutes ago, from memory, an address she'd kept in her head because she'd learned years ago that the things you keep only in your head are the only things nobody can take from you. She'd set the address in the 6 seconds she'd had, while Lucien was opening the stairwell door and Harlan was catching his breath, and nobody was watching what her hands were doing on the phone Lucien had briefly given her. She hadn't told either of them she'd done it. She turned around. Crow was still in the room. He'd been in the corner during all of it, which told her something about who Elias Crow was in a physical confrontation. Not a coward, she didn't think that, but a man who understood his own value and kept it away from unnecessary risk. He was looking at the screen. "It's done," she said. "I can see that." "The name," he said, "on the beneficial ownership record." She looked at him. The gray eyes in the indicator light glow, flat and watchful, and patient, with the particular patience of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific piece of information. "Victor Lane," she said. Crow didn't move. Lucien, by the door, said nothing. He'd said nothing since she'd told him Victor Lane had not in fact been dead for 2 years. He'd absorbed it the way you absorb something that has broken a load-bearing wall, quietly, without visible collapse, but with the specific stillness of a structure that is redistributing weight it didn't expect to be carrying. "Victor Lane has been dead since," Crow started. "His death was fabricated," Harlan said from the chair. His voice was steady now, the tremor from before gone into some quieter place. "The documentation in the archival layer goes back 14 months before the reported death. He was already building the exit structure. The plan was always to disappear into the system he'd built, become the invisible hand behind an infrastructure that everyone used but nobody looked at." He paused. "He didn't die. He became the broker. He's been operating from inside the Meridian architecture itself for 2 years. Crow sat down on the edge of the secondary terminal desk. She'd never seen him sit like that. Not in a chair, chosen, but on an edge, the way people sit when their legs have made a decision their brain hasn't approved yet. "I knew Victor for 11 years, he said. Nobody answered. "He built 4 of my most profitable operations. He had access to my financial structure going back to—" He stopped. He looked at the floor. "Going back to when I trusted him." "Which is how he built the extraction mechanism," Serafina said. "Not without gentleness, but without softening it either. He had access because you gave it to him, and because you trusted him, you didn't audit the infrastructure he built. And because you didn't audit, you didn't see the withdrawal pattern until it had been running for 8 years. She paused. The loss you suffered wasn't because you were careless. It was because he was good at being someone worth trusting. Crow looked at her. The gray eyes had something in them that she didn't have a name for. Not softness, something adjacent to it, in the way a scar is adjacent to skin. "We need to move," Lucien said from the door. She looked at him. "Victor knows tonight went wrong," he said. "He'll try to access the system remotely to trigger the deletion before he understands the tripwire is in place. When the deletion fails, he'll know we have the records. And when he knows we have the records, he runs," she said, "unless we give him a reason to surface." She thought about that. The shape of it. The logic. "You know where he is," she said. Lucien looked at her for a moment. "I know where he goes when he needs to disappear. There's a location. A building he used as a secondary operations center before the death. He kept it because it wasn't in his name, and because he was the kind of man who kept things he thought he might need again." He paused. "I kept track of it because I was the kind of man who kept track of things like that." 8 months you knew," Crow said. He was looking at Lucien, and his voice had a flatness to it that was different from his usual flatness. 8 months you knew Victor was alive, and you said nothing." "I didn't know he was the broker until 6 weeks ago." "But you knew he was alive." Lucien met his eyes. "Yes." The silence between them was a specific kind, old, freighted, the kind that exists between people who have a history that includes things they're not going to say in front of a third party. She let it be. She'd learned tonight that some silences were doing work and needed to be left alone. "I'll send the records through the neutral channel before we move," she said. "Harlan, the transmission protocol, can it be initiated manually before any deletion attempt?" "Already done," Harlan said. He turned in the chair. He looked exhausted, the way structures look exhausted when the stress has been on them for too long. Not broken, but the evidence of the load visible in every line. "I initiated a conditional transmission when I set the tripwire. The records are already en route to your external address. The tripwire is a secondary failsafe." He looked at her with something in his face that was the most unguarded she'd seen from him all night. "Whatever happens in the next hour, the records survive," she breathed. It was the first full breath she'd taken, she realized, since she'd sat down in that chair on the 43rd floor platform, maybe 5 hours ago, with a tray on the table beside her and 60 pairs of eyes deciding what she was worth. She picked up the heels she'd abandoned in the stairwell. She'd carried them in her hand without noticing, and looked at them and set them back down. She walked to the door in her stockings. "The building," she said to Lucien. "How far?" 10 minutes by car." "Then let's go." The building was an abandoned financial exchange on the harbor, 12 stories, all glass and structural steel, that had been modern once and was now the particular kind of neglected that happened to buildings when the institutions inside them outgrew relevance before the architecture did. Its windows were dark except for the 8th floor, where a single light burned behind glass that hadn't been cleaned in 2 years. She stood across the street and looked at it, and the harbor behind it was black water under a sky that had been threatening rain all night and had finally started making good on the threat. A thin, cold drizzle that collected in her hair and ran down the back of her neck. Lucien was on her left. Crow, who had insisted on coming with a simplicity that didn't invite discussion, was on her right. Behind them, in the car, Harlan was on a phone call to someone she hadn't been introduced to, speaking in a low, rapid voice about documentation and verification and a word she caught that sounded like federal. 8th floor, she said. "Yes," Lucien said. "He's been watching the system remotely. He knows the deletion failed. He knows someone is inside the archival layer." She looked at the light. "He's deciding right now whether to run or try to reach the server." "If he runs, he's built another exit," Crow said. "Another identity, another infrastructure. He's had 2 years to prepare." "Then he doesn't run," she said. Both men looked at her. "He doesn't run because the records aren't just evidence of what he did. They're evidence of what everyone else did, too. As long as the records exist and he's the broker, the one who built the system, who directed the extractions, who orchestrated the entire architecture. He has leverage. Every name in those files is someone who will spend significant resources making sure the records don't surface in a form that implicates them. She looked at the building. He's not going to run. He's going to try to make a deal. He's going to try to make the same deal he's been making for 8 years. I know where the bodies are. Pay me to keep quiet about yours. She paused. Which means he needs someone to make the deal with. He needs contact. You want to give it to him, Lucien said. I want to give him the one thing that will make him surface and confirm his own identity in front of witnesses on record. She turned and looked at him. I want to give him you. Lucien was quiet. He staged his death, she said. Whatever the reason, Victor Lani disappeared from his life 2 years ago, and you were part of that life. If you contact him now, tonight, from outside that building, and tell him you know he's alive, that you've known for 8 months, that you're not here with Crow's people, that you want to talk. She watched Lucien's face. He'll come down. You don't know that. He gave you the 3rd access code 3 years ago. He built you into the deepest layer of his architecture. She said it as carefully as she could, which was as carefully as the situation allowed, which was not very. People don't do that for professional reasons. Lucien looked at the building for a long moment. No, he said. They don't. He took out his phone. He made the call. She stepped away to give him the distance of it. Not far. She needed to hear that the call was made, but far enough. She stood in the drizzle and looked at the harbor and listened to Lucien's voice behind her, low and specific, saying a name into the phone that wasn't the broker. That was Victor, just Victor, the name of a person rather than a function. She heard him say, I know you're up there. I know you've been up there for 2 years. I'm outside. Come down. A pause. Then, because I have the records, and I have Crow, and I have a woman who found your page 31 transaction in 40 minutes and built a tripwire on your own system using your own architecture. He paused. And because I need to hear you say it yourself. Another pause, then he lowered the phone. She turned around. He's coming down, Lucien said. The lobby of the building was unlocked. Abandoned buildings in this part of the harbor district existed in a specific legal limbo that meant nobody maintained the locks, the liability having been transferred enough times that it had effectively dissolved. They went in and she stood in the dark and the cold and the smell of a space that had been populated once and wasn't anymore, the ghost of institutional furniture in the wear patterns on the floor. Victor Lane came down in the freight elevator. She'd built a picture of him from the records and from Lucien's silences and from the shape of what he'd built. And the picture was of someone large in some abstract sense, someone whose intelligence had the quality of a designed system, deliberate, layered, building towards something rather than responding to things. The man who stepped out of the freight elevator was 50, perhaps, with a lean frame and the kind of face that had been carefully ordinary, carefully forgettable, the face of someone who had practiced being the background of other people's attention. He was dressed in civilian clothes, dark, practical. He looked like someone who had been sitting in a building for 2 years. He saw Lucien first. Something happened in his face. Not the grief that had been in Lucien's face in the alley, something harder, more complicated, the face of someone who has spent 2 years on the other side of a decision and has stopped letting himself feel its full weight and is being made to feel it now. He saw Crow second. He saw Serafina third. He looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention she'd been on the receiving end of all evening, the assessment, the cataloging, the rapid recalibration. Then he looked back at Lucien. You brought a hotel maid, he said. His voice was lighter than she'd expected, almost dry. She found you, Lucien said. The page 31 transaction. Yes. Victor looked at her again. I've been building this for 11 years, he said. 14 people across 6 continents, a clearinghouse infrastructure that processed hundreds of billions, a disappearance that every intelligence service in 3 countries filed as confirmed. He paused. And a 24-year-old hotel worker found me in 4 hours because I transposed a routing code on one transfer. You didn't transpose it, she said. You omitted it. You knew it was a tell and you made one transaction clean, which made it visible by contrast. She held his gaze. You wanted someone to find it. He was quiet. You built the exit, but you left the door, she said. You spent 2 years inside a system with nobody who knew you were alive, and eventually that became its own kind of problem. She thought about what Harlan had said in the alley, hidden in the thing they think they own. She thought about Victor in the 8th floor with a single light for 2 years. You built the breadcrumb, not Harlan. Harlan found it and used it, but you put it there. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lucienne. She's right, he said, simply, like a door finally opening after a long time closed. Lucienne said nothing. The quality of his silence was something she'd learned to read over the course of the night. And what she read in it now was not anger and not forgiveness. Both of those required a kind of resolution that wasn't available yet, but something more primary: presence. He was standing there in that abandoned building with the harbor rain outside, and he was letting the full weight of the situation be the full weight of the situation instead of managing it into something smaller. She turned to Crow. Crow was looking at Victor with those gray eyes, and she watched the history of 11 years move through his face without being able to name any of the specific things she was seeing. Then he said, "Was any of it real?" Victor looked at him. "Most of it," he said. "That's the honest answer. Most of it was real." The extraction mechanism started as a contingency and became a compulsion, and I didn't stop it when I should have, and by the time I understood what it had become, I was inside it too far to see the edges. He paused. The disappearance was the only way out I could construct. "You could have told me," Crow said. "I could have," Victor said. "I didn't." The simplicity of it sat in the air. "There are federal contacts outside," Serafina said. "The records are already in transit to a neutral verification body. This ends tonight either in a controlled manner or not." She looked at Victor. "That's the choice. How it ends." Victor looked at her with those carefully ordinary eyes. "How old are you?" he said. 24. "What did you do before tonight?" "Cleaned rooms, 31st through 35th floors." He almost smiled. It was a real smile, she thought, the ghost of one. Something genuine moving through the careful, forgettable face. "And now?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know it starts with this." She held his gaze. She didn't reach for authority she didn't have. She didn't perform certainty about what came after. She just stood in front of him in her stockings on a cold floor in an abandoned building with the harbor rain on the windows and held the line she'd drawn. Victor Lane nodded. It was a very small movement, almost nothing. It was everything. Harlan came in from outside, phone still in hand, and said 2 words to Crow that she didn't catch. And the lobby filled with other people, people she hadn't met. And the shape of the evening resolved into process, documentation, identification, the particular bureaucratic machinery of a situation being formally contained. She stepped back from the center of it. She found a column near the freight elevator and put her back against it and stood there and let the room do what it was going to do without her in the middle of it. Her feet hurt. Her shoulders ached from some impact she didn't remember clearly. Her hair was wet from the drizzle, and she was still in the hotel uniform, the one she'd put on hours ago in a service corridor that smelled like bleach, while a drunk man with better luck than he deserved got to go home early. She watched Lucien across the lobby. He was standing near Victor, not close, but not far, in the way people stand near something that has been the center of a significant portion of their life. Victor was talking to 2 people she didn't know, calm, cooperative, the way someone is cooperative when they've made a decision, and the decision has its own momentum now. Lucien felt her watching. He turned. He walked across the lobby and stood in front of her with the column at her back and the harbor rain on the windows, and the careful noise of a situation being processed around them. "You knew he wanted to be found," Lucicia said. "I thought it was possible." "How?" She thought about how to say it. "The architecture was too good," she said finally. Everything he built was designed to be invisible. The identifier system, the extraction mechanism, the staged death, all of it was optimized to not be found. But the page 31 transaction wasn't an error. Victor doesn't make errors like that. The omission was intentional, and it was the only thing in the entire system that could be intentional without a visible motive. She looked at Victor across the lobby. He built himself a door. He just needed someone to knock. Lucian was quiet for a moment. Why? Because 2 years is a long time to be invisible, she said. And some things, once you've done them, you need someone else to know you did them, not to confess, not for absolution. She paused. Just to have it be real. To have someone see the whole shape of what you built and understand that it was, whatever else it was, a remarkable thing. She looked at Lucien. That's also why he gave you the third access code, she said. He looked back at her, and for a moment his face was exactly what it was. Nothing managed, nothing contained, just the face of someone who had spent 8 months carrying the knowledge that a person he'd trusted was alive and had chosen to be absent and had given him a code into the deepest layer of what they'd built as the only communication they'd offered. Yes, he said. She didn't say anything else about it. She understood that there were things in the history between those two men that would take years to become fully visible, and some that never would, and that was not her work. 4 months later, the Meridian Clearinghouse was formally dissolved by a joint legal action involving documentation from Harlan's archival records and the cooperation of the 6 syndicate members who had been its primary victims. The proceedings were not public. The outcome was not announced. But the infrastructure that had silently extracted from the criminal economy for 8 years was dismantled in 11 weeks by people whose names she would never fully know, using evidence she had helped surface in a 10-foot by 12 server room in stockings with a broken heel. Victor Lane entered a formal cooperation arrangement that took 3 months to negotiate and several years to complete. The terms were not her business. She didn't ask about them. Harlan retired, or something that looked enough like retirement that the difference didn't matter. He sent her a message 4 months after the building. 3 words. The records held. She read it standing at a window in an office that was hers now. A rented space in a building she'd chosen specifically because it had good light and no associations with anything that had come before. And she wrote back 2 words. I know. She never returned to the 31st through 35th floors. She didn't go back for the heels she'd left in the server room. She had been told, weeks later, that the floor manager had tried to reach her about the events of the evening and had eventually stopped trying, which she considered an adequate professional conclusion. The consulting firm she established operated independently, outside the structures she'd spent one night mapping. She was 24 when she started it, and 25 when it had its first 6 clients, and 26 when she stopped counting. The clients came from the world she'd glimpsed in the Black Meridian ballroom, but they came to her rather than her going to them, and the distinction was the only one that mattered. She did not see Elias Crow again. She saw Lucien Voss on a Tuesday afternoon 6 months after the harbor building, unplanned, on a street in a part of the city she'd gone to for reasons that had nothing to do with him. He was on the other side of the street. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Neither of them crossed. They stood on opposite curbs with traffic between them, and she looked at him, and he looked at her with the particular quality of attention she'd learned over the course of one night. The attention that didn't perform itself. That was just attention, and after a moment he nodded once, the same way Victor Lane had nodded in the lobby, and she nodded back, and the light changed, and they both continued in their separate directions. She thought about that for a while afterward. Not with regret and not with longing and not with any of the emotions that the situation might appear to call for from the outside. She thought about it the way she thought about the page 31 transaction, as a deliberate omission, a space left open by design, in a structure that was otherwise very precisely constructed. Some doors you notice and don't walk through, not because you don't see them, because you understand that the space on the other side of them needs to remain a space for now, and that there is value in the not yet that is distinct from the never. On a morning in late spring, 8 months after the ballroom, she stood at the window of her office on the 14th floor of a building that had no particular history she was aware of, and watched the city arrange itself in the early light, the streets filling, the particular ordinary complexity of a city doing what cities do when the people inside them are not paying attention to the larger structures within which their days are moving. She had arrived at the Black Meridian Hotel with a tray. She had arrived at this window by a path that was not straight and was not clean and had cost things she hadn't known she had to spend. She thought about the floor manager's face when he'd handed her the tray, the weight of it, the way he'd looked at her, the particular expression that said replaceable, forgettable, background. She thought about 60 pairs of eyes swinging in her direction when she'd spoken a single sentence about a customs flag. She thought about the chair under the single overhead light, the tablet, the pattern she'd found in 40 minutes that had taken everyone else 8 years to not find. She thought about Victor's question in the lobby. And now? She'd said she didn't know yet. She knew now. She turned from the window and sat at her desk and opened her files and began to work. And the city continued outside the glass, and the light moved across the floor the way light moves, indifferent and necessary, illuminating whatever happened to be there. A waitress walks into a mafia boss's wedding, and the whole room freezes. Not because she's beautiful, not because she's famous, but because the necklace she's wearing, a phoenix carved from black obsidian, is something the world's most powerful mob bosses thought they buried with a mysterious woman 15 years ago. And in that instant, Rowan Vale, a 26-year-old woman working 3 jobs, becomes the most wanted woman in Blackridge. This is her story. Watch to the end, hit like, and comment with the name of the city you're watching in. Let me know how far this story has come. The storm hit Blackridge the way bad news always did, without warning and all at once. By 7 in the evening, rain was hammering the streets hard enough to blur the city lights into long, wet smears across the pavement. Rowan Vale stood at the service entrance of the Vescari estate, her collar soaked through before she even made it inside, and she was already 40 minutes late because the bus that was supposed to take her across the Meridian Bridge had broken down 3 stops short, and she'd run the rest of the way in second-hand heels that were half a size too small. She pressed her back against the